Good morning. Happy Passover. Happy Easter. This is Joe Yudin, founder and owner of Touring Israel Luxury Private Tours. And since you can't come to Israel during the coronavirus epidemic, we're trying to bring a little bit of Israel to you. Today, we have special guest, Matti Friedman. Matti Friedman was a reporter for the AP in the Jerusalem Bureau. He's a best-selling author. He served in the IDF and the infantry. And we are lucky enough to have him. He also writes for many periodicals, including the New York Times op-ed section sometimes. Matti Friedman, welcome.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
A real pleasure and honor to have you here. We actually met that Jono, who's one of our Israel specialists and behind-the-scenes tech guru, Jono Rose, who's pulling the strings behind the scenes here. He read an article, I believe it was in Tablet magazine, about how Israel is really a smaller problem in the bigger problem of the Middle East. And that was the article that Jono, here he's going to put it up, An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. And he read that article. He showed it to me. We thought it was very interesting, and that you would be a great, back in 2014, you would be a great guest to have to meet our tourists in their hotels for breakfast and discuss this issue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this article, how you came about it, and the gist of it?
I thought you were going to tell me to say something about the breakfasts, which have been really superb.
Please.
A cut above what I usually eat with my kids at home. The article started with my work as a correspondent for the AP, for the Associated Press, which is the big U.S. news agency. I was a reporter here in Jerusalem for the AP for about 5.5 years, between the summer of 2006 and the very end of 2011. And I went in pretty naive about the way the international news industry works, and I came out quite cynical about how it works, particularly about the coverage of Israel, which I found to be very problematic. And I came at it as someone who's always been pretty left on Israeli politics, and I didn't have an expectation that I would have any problems working for a mainstream outfit like the AP, and I did. I had many problems, and I eventually decided that I couldn't really continue working there because the story that I was being asked to write was too distant from the reality of the country as I knew it. And it took me a while to figure out exactly what was going on. It took me a while at the agency, and then even after I left, which was at the very end of 2011, beginning of 2012, I didn't immediately write anything about it. I was still kind of mixed up about it, and I was kind of angry. And it's a bad idea to write things when you're angry, by the way, as a rule for any aspiring writers. So I sat on it for a few years, and then in the summer of 2014, which is what you mentioned, and after which I ended up meeting Jono here in Jerusalem, I just sat down, and there was this war in Gaza that summer, of course, as you remember, and it was kind of awful. It was awful for everyone, for the people in Gaza and for us here in Israel, and for people who are sympathetic to Israel, who are reading the news about this war from America or from countries in the West. And the coverage was so bad and so flawed and so different from the realities of the events that I decided that the time had come to actually write something, because unlike most people who get agitated about Israel coverage, I actually know how it works because I was an insider and I saw the malfunctions close up. And I also am someone who doesn't hate the media, and I like many of the people who I wrote about, including the people who really messed up the coverage. I like them on a personal level and don't think that they're motivated by evil or anything like that. So I thought it was important that I sit down to actually try to diagnose this problem once and for all. And I sat down, I wrote this essay for Tablet, and it was pretty long. It was 4,000, 5,000 words. I didn't think very many people would read it. Tablet's a great magazine, but it's not like the New York Times, in terms of readership. So I thought my dad was going to read it. I knew my dad would be pretty happy with it, and you, and a few other people. And then it went viral. The response was unbelievable, and it turned out to be published right at the end of the war, and people had been kind of just getting angrier and more confused about the coverage all summer. And then the article came out right at the end, and it seemed to really strike a chord. And it was all over the place. I've never written anything that had that kind of response. I was inundated. I had to turn off my phone. I had to ignore emails. I'm just a reporter. I never really had that kind of response to an article. I followed that up with another article, which was basically part 2 of that essay for The Atlantic, and it came out a month later. And together those stories were shared 130,000 times on Facebook, and they're still quoted back at me more than anything else I've ever written. So it kind of became my calling card.
Great. So yeah, I know you talk about how one of the things I use in my guiding, even to this day, is that when you talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict is not the problem in the Middle East, and that if you really want to understand the Middle East, you need to zoom out and look at the entire picture. And I found that all three of your books, best-selling books, award-winning books, the Aleppo Codex, Pumpkin Flowers, and Spies of No Country, it all talks about this. It all talks about how the Israel-Palestinian conflict is part of a greater Middle Eastern cultural problem. And we'll talk a little bit about that. First, I wanted to ask you, obviously you weren't born in Israel, okay? You have that accent that Sabras rarely have at all, even the ones who come from we call them Anglo parents. Tell me a little bit about where you come from. Did you have a religious childhood? When did you make Aliyah or immigrate to Israel with your family? What drove you family to come to Israel?
So I was born in Toronto and raised there. My dad's an American from New York, but I grew up in Toronto. And when I finished high school, I was 17 years old, and I decided I was going to Israel, and I was going to go to a kibbutz. I had this idea about a kibbutz, and I heard there was such a thing as a religious kibbutz. And I came from a traditional home, I guess, kind of laid back, traditional. And I ended up on this small religious kibbutz not far from where you live called Ma'ale Gilboa, which was, at the time, this was 1995. I was 17 years old. The place was less than 30 families. It was almost dead. It was really kind of about to expire, and I didn't know that. I thought it was the greatest place on earth. They had a dining hall, and I worked in the dairy barn with the cows, and I met these wonderful people, and I had this incredible year. And a few months in, I decided I wasn't going back to Toronto. I decided that this was where I needed to be, and I wanted to speak Hebrew, and I wanted to be here. And the truth is, I haven't looked back since that fall of 1995. And I ended up staying on Ma'ale Gilboa for a few years. My parents ended up coming to the same kibbutz and then moving on. They now live in Nahariya, which is a small city on the coast near Lebanon, near the border with Lebanon. And I went into the army in 97. We stayed on the kibbutz, and eventually I ended up in Jerusalem, which is where I live now. I came here to study at Hebrew University in 2000 and met my wife here and kind of put down roots here in Jerusalem. So I've been here for about, 20 years.
Did you know Hebrew before you made Aliyah? Before you
I had
came
a very basic Hebrew. I went to a Jewish school until 6th grade, and then moved to public school. So I had some Hebrew. I had synagogue Hebrew. I knew my way around the Torah, but I couldn't have a conversation in Hebrew when I arrived on the kibbutz. And the advantage of Ma'ale Gilboa, which I knew at the time, was that they had no program for North Americans. There was nothing there. No one wanted to speak to me in English. I was working, in the dairy barn. There were no Hebrew classes. There was no programming. No one really knew what to do with me at first. And it wasn't like they had volunteers, and I expected to be taken care of, and I wasn't really. They kind of threw me in, and in retrospect, that was perfect, because within a few months I was speaking Hebrew, and I kind of could handle everything by myself. And of course, 3 years in the army was also a pretty intense Hebrew instruction course, although a very weird kind of Hebrew that involved a lot of technical language and a lot of swearing. But at the end of my army service, I was fluent, and to this day, I live most of my life, I guess, in Hebrew. I write in English, but I'm married to an Israeli, and I live in a very kind of Hebrew-speaking environment.
Which unit did you serve in the army?
I served in a brigade called Nachal, which is an infantry brigade. Nachal is a Hebrew acronym for Noal Chalutzi Lochem, the fighting pioneer youth. And it's kind of this beautiful relic of the old labor Zionist times in Israel. I can see on the screen that John will put this picture up. That's me and my platoon in 1998 inside Lebanon at this isolated outpost in Lebanon called Outpost Pumpkin, in Hebrew Mutav Dlat. And that's us in one of the bunkers. The guy who's saluting absolutely nothing, like an idiot, is me. And those are my friends from my unit who I'm still pretty close with.
So your book, Pumpkin Flowers, that's it's an amazing book. After I read it, we have a very similar background. I grew up in New Jersey. First I went to college before I'd ever come to Israel, and then I wanted to go on an adventure after college. I backpacked around Europe. I finally came alone to Israel, fell in love with the place, went went to a kibbutz where I volunteer, Ein HaShofet, not far from Malay Gilboa. And the Gulf War started in 1991, and after that, I made Aliyah. I was drafted. I served in the paratroopers, and I spent, you know, a good amount of time in southern Lebanon. Just a little background for those who don't know: in the late 70s, Yasser Arafat and the PLO was entrenched in southern Lebanon. It was kind of a country within a country, and they were shooting missiles into Israel. And it got so bad in 1982 that Menachem Begin sent the entire Israeli army in to push the PLO out of southern Lebanon. To make a long story short, we got stuck there until the year 2000 in southern Lebanon. Initially, the Americans and the French were supposed to be a peacekeeping force. After a couple suicide bombs, they left. And so I too spent a good amount of time in southern Lebanon. And after I read your book, I couldn't sleep that night. I was tossing and turning, and the next morning, my wife goes, "What was wrong with you? You didn't sleep well last night." All I could say was the word Lebanon, and I think this book really captures that time period that no one really talks about, the 1990s, that all Israeli soldiers were rotating in and out of Lebanon, and there's this low intensity conflict. That it was a war, but it was low intensity war going on, and we lost hundreds of soldiers. Tell us a little bit about that time. Also, what struck a chord in me in Pumpkin Flowers and your other two books that we'll talk a little bit about as well was the diversity of Israel. And you really find this in the army. You know, you and I think you as well, maybe you want to talk about that as well, both come from the Ashkenazi world, the Central Eastern European world of Judaism, where Jews who came from Germany and Russia in that area came to New York and spread out over North America and became successful and entrenched in North American society. And it's a very specific type of Judaism, which is only half of the Jews of the world. So when we came to Israel, for me anyway, it was a shock to find that most Israelis were not Ashkenazi. They were Middle Eastern Jews. I eventually married a girl whose parents were born and raised for a short period in Tunisia. So how tell us a little bit about that if you can. I know that's a big question, but that's what struck me from all of your writing.
I think that what happened is that, like you and like most North American Jews, I grew up with this very kind of Europe-centric story about Israel, which is Herzl and pogroms and the kibbutz idea and the Holocaust. And that, of course, is very much the story of the founding of Israel. It's not that it's a fake story or anything, but you come to Israel, and if you have your eyes open, then you realize that the story doesn't explain the country. So if you're just standing on a street in Jerusalem or Afula near you, and you're trying to understand the country using stories about Herzl and the kibbutz, you're not going to get anywhere, because the real country has very little to do with that. And there are many reasons for that, but the main reason, in my opinion, is what you said, which is that at least half of the Jews in Israel come from the Islamic world. Half. The numbers are a bit fuzzy because of intermarriage and because there's some disagreement about what exactly is the Middle East and what isn't. But demographers agree that it's at least half of the Jews in Israel who have roots in the Islamic world and don't come from Warsaw, and they don't come from Vienna, they don't come from New Jersey, they come from Casablanca, they come from Tunisia, they come from Isfahan, they come from Tehran and Damascus. And that's not a footnote in the story of the country, it's the country. And yet it's not reflected in the stories we still tell about the country, particularly in the West. So people still know Moshe Dayan, and they know Golda Meir, and they know the 6-Day War, and they know that kind of great old Israeli story. And it really is a great story, but it's not the story of the country. It's certainly not the whole story of the country. And I really realized that in Lebanon, which is funny. My Israeli education and my Israeli kind of absorption happened not in Israel, but in Lebanon. I came to Israel to a kibbutz because that's what I knew. I identified Israel with the kibbutz, and came to a kibbutz, and then joined the army and got sent to this wild place. It which was a Middle Eastern country, is fabulously beautiful, as you remember, and dangerous and crazy. And suddenly there were Arabic-speaking Christians who were our allies. There were these militia guys who were Christians, but they spoke Arabic. What is a Christian who speaks Arabic? What is that? And the guy, and the enemy they were Shia Muslims. What on earth is a Shia Muslim? I came thinking about kibbutz ideology and Aleph Daled Adi Gordon and Borochov and was what are Shia Muslims and what on earth is going on here? And even the soldiers with me in the outpost didn't come from Warsaw, they didn't come from Toronto. A lot of them came from Persia and they came from Morocco, and it was a whole different scene, and the way they practiced Judaism was different, and the whole thing was different. And I think since then I've really been on a quest to understand what on earth is going on, and mainly for myself. And I've found that my own exploration of this and my own conclusions about it are actually useful for other people who are trying to figure out the country. And that's what I've been trying to write about. So there's a bit of it in Pumpkin Flowers. I really got into it when I wrote this book called the Aleppo Codex, which is about, on the surface, it's about the most important copy of the Bible in Hebrew, but it's really about, it ended up being about this lost Jewish community from Aleppo and the lost Jewish world of Jews among Arabs. There were 1 million Jews who were native to the Islamic world in the 40s. That's not very long ago. That's the lifetime of our parents, and they're gone. And what was that world, and what happened to it, and how it plays into the Israeli present? Those are big questions for me. So it started for me with the Aleppo Codex, and I wrote a book about it more recently called Spies of No Country, which is an exploration of that. But that's really, I think, what Western observers need to understand about the country. It's very hard for Westerners to make that leap from a story about the West to a story about other people. And people are really interested in stories if they're about them, which is why a lot of people in the West project their own ideas onto Israel, whether they're good or bad. Sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative, but most of them are unrealistic. And not very many people seem to be really interested in places that are truly foreign. So people want a story about Israel that sounds like them. They want a Judaism that sounds like their Judaism, and they want it to be about the stories that they know and the places that they know, but it isn't. Israel's a completely different place. And if you try to understand it using Warsaw, you're not going to get anywhere. If you try to understand it using Aleppo, it actually makes a lot of sense, or Kurdistan, that makes a lot of sense. But because almost all North American Jews are Ashkenazi, they're European in origin, mostly Eastern European, that makes it hard to make that leap from the Ashkenazi Jewish story to the Middle Eastern Jewish story. Almost all North American Jews are Ashkenazim. Only half of Israeli Jews are Ashkenazim. That's a big difference. It might be the big difference, and it's one that we all need to wrap our heads around.
Right. So in your book, The Aleppo Codex, really struck me because I thought I knew the story about the Aleppo Codex. For those of you who don't know what the Aleppo Codex was, it's the authoritative version of the Bible called the Masoretic text. It was written in Tiberias, which is one of the 4 holy cities here in Israel, in the 10th century CE AD, which is the main city on the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. After the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, the Romans, Hadrian comes in and pushes the Jews up into the Galilee where Tiberias is, and that becomes the center of Jewish thought for the world for some time. The Mishnah and the Talmud began in the Galilee, and the last place where the Jerusalem version of the Talmud is written is Tiberias, which is codified in the 5th century AD. And that's where the last place where the Jewish Sanhedrin meets until the Byzantine Church bans its meeting. So Tiberias is a center of Eastern Jewish thought, as well as Babylonia at the time. And that book that we're taking a look at, part of it right now, that survives, that book was taken to Jerusalem for safekeeping. It doesn't last too long there because of the Crusades, who kill all the Jews of Jerusalem. They burn a lot of them in their synagogues. They steal their treasures, including the Aleppo Codex. They ransom it to the Jewish community in Egypt. Thank God Maimonides, the Ramban, is there. And he uses this book that we're looking at now, that today part of it is in Jerusalem in the Shrine of the Book, part of the Israel Museum. You can see it, part of it anyway. Rambam uses this book to write his other books, to refer to it, and it becomes it spent the time with the Karaite community of Jerusalem. It becomes the authoritative version of the Bible. after there were problems in Egypt, it makes its way up into Aleppo in Syria, where it stays for hundreds of years, for centuries. And your book, the way you write, flashing back and forth to the 20th century and then through the ages of all the places that the book has been and the stories behind it. What struck me towards the end of the book is that this book isn't about the Aleppo Codex, is it? It's about something deeper. It's more about the Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or Sephardic divide within Israel. I don't want to give too much away because the book is such a page turner. It's like a Le Carre spy novel. It really, but it's true. It's all true. And everything that I knew about as a tour guide, and I consider myself a pretty good tour guide. I'm doing my doctorate now in Israel studies. Everything I thought I knew about the Codex is wrong. And you piece together the story. You go out and you find new information about it, and I think you put together the authoritative story of what happened to the Codex. But tell me a little bit about it, but also a little bit about the deeper story, the underlying plot to your book.
Well, thank you for those kind words about the book. It started with an AP article that I wrote in 2008, and I was basically trying to get out of writing conflict stories because all we're doing is writing these endless stories about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it was incredibly boring. I discovered that my editors would let me get out of the conflict coverage if I could provide good stories about biblical archaeology, because there's a big audience for that in the States. And if you can, I mean, as you know, Joe, and if you can write a story about King David or Jesus, and that people are really, really interested. And so I was kind of on the lookout for that kind of story, and I blundered into the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum. I don't even remember why I was there. And of course, everyone knows the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are on the main floor of the Shrine of the Book. But on the bottom floor, which is basically a basement in the Shrine of the Book, a lot of people don't even go there when they go through the shrine. Mm-hmm. There's this other manuscript called the Aleppo Codex. And I understood from the labels that the Aleppo Codex is actually the authoritative copy of the Bible in Hebrew. And yet I'd never heard of it, which is strange because I grew up in a fairly educated Jewish home, and I'd never heard of the Aleppo Codex, and that seemed strange. So I sat down and I wrote a story about it for the AP in the summer of 2008. Almost everything I wrote in that story is wrong. I didn't know that at the time, but that later emerged. And then I said, you know what, it would be interesting to, explore this further. And I decided I would try to write a book about it. I had no idea what writing a book involved at the time. I'd never written a book before. And I started making calls, and I discovered that the moment I moved beyond this very simplistic story that I had been told in my article in which I had published, the moment you try to move beyond that story and kind of fill in some of the blanks, people didn't want to talk to me. It was very interesting and surprising. The academics who are in charge of the Aleppo Codex didn't want to talk to me. The Aleppo community, people from the Aleppo community didn't really want to talk to me. No one wanted to talk to me. And I realized as a journalist that if no one wants to talk to you, there's probably something going on. So I put everything aside, basically, and spent a few years on the Aleppo Codex trying to figure out the story of the Codex, which turned out to be completely different than what I had thought, and much dirtier and uglier and more interesting than the story which I had originally intended to write, which was a historic narrative about how Israel rescues this holy book from Aleppo, Syria, and brings it home. That wasn't the story. It was a different story, and it ended up teaching me a lot, not just about the Bible and about the importance of the Bible and the Jewish, and the history of the Jewish people, but about the state of Israel and who lives here and how people got here. And it really led me ultimately to a different way of thinking about Israel, which took me years to kind of put into words. But I think we tell this story about Israel, which is that Zionism is a European idea. European Jews found the state of Israel and then are joined by Jews who come from Islamic countries. People come in from Morocco or from Yemen or Syria or whatever. But those are secondary characters in the story. But there's a different way of looking at it. If you understand that half of Israeli Jews come from the Islamic world, and if you understand that there were 1 million Jews native to this part of the world in the 40s before the state of Israel was founded, you can tell the state of Israel, you can tell the story of the state in a different way. You can say there were always Jews in the Islamic world, always, from before the days of Islam. And in the 20th century, because of various catastrophes in Europe, the remnants of European Judaism come to the Middle East and insert themselves into the Islamic world and join the story of the Jews who were always here. And then the main characters in the story aren't Europeans. They're the Jews who were here before. And that makes you see everything in a very different light. And I really kind of started to see the country in that way. And it's an incomplete narrative. You need both narratives to make sense of the place. And what's going on here is not one thing. There are numerous things going on here, but I think if you see it that way, a lot of things about the country become clear. The music that people listen to, the pop music people listen to on the radio, which is Middle Eastern, the food that people eat here, which is Middle Eastern, the Judaism that's practiced here, which is Middle Eastern, our politics, which are quite Middle Eastern for better or worse. The country makes much more sense if you put the Middle East in the center and think a lot less about Europe.
Right. Not only were those Oriental or Mizrahi Jews, Middle Eastern Jews here before the Ashkenazim get here, they were here before the Arabs got here, which is something.
That's right. We call them today. Call them Jews of Arab lands or something like that. But Jews were in Aleppo long before Aleppo was Arab. Right. The Arab conquerors arrived in Aleppo in the 7th century. There are Jews in Aleppo at least 250 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. So the community in Aleppo is ancient before Christianity. It's ancient before Islam. So they become Jews of Arab lands when the Arabs arrive, not when the Jews arrive in Arab lands. This is an ancient world that needs to be understood as one of the native communities of the Middle East. In many of these places, the Arabs were newcomers and the Jews were there long before.
Right. That's something you often point out, that Israel isn't, that the Jews of Israel come from all over the world, and half of them come from the Islamic world as well. But you also remind us in your books that the Arabs as well come from other places, and a lot of them have a last name like Baghdadi or Mughrabi, and everyone here, not just the Jews, have roots in other places. But did you get the idea for Spies of No Country from your research that you did for the Aleppo Codex?
Totally. That Spies of No Country started with a conversation that I had with one of the characters in the Aleppo Codex. If you've read the book, then you remember Rafi Siton, who is a character. He's at the time he was in the 80s. He's an ex-Mossad character. If I made up the character of Rafi Siton, people would say it's a ridiculous invention. It could only be real. He's got a wild story of his own. He's a famous character inside the world of Israeli intelligence, and he's one of the main characters in the Aleppo Codex because he carried out his own kind of private investigation into the fate of the Aleppo Codex. He himself was born and raised in Aleppo, Syria, before coming to Israel around the time that the state was founded. And in one of our conversations, Rafi said, "Listen, Matti, you should really meet my friend who's an even older spy than me, whose name is Yitzhak Shoshan." And I didn't know why, really. But as I write in the book, if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, you should go. Just go. Don't worry about why. So I did, and I got into the car. This was 2011, so the Aleppo Codex wasn't even out yet. And I got into the car from Jerusalem, drove to Bat Yam, and met Yitzhak Shoshan. And he was, at the time, almost 90. Today, by my calculation, he's 96. And he told me a story about the founding of the state of Israel that I had never heard before. And it was a story about a small unit that belonged to the Palmach, which was one of the pre-state militias. It was a unit that consisted of maybe a dozen guys at the beginning of the War of Independence. Half of them didn't make it, and half of them, like Yitzhak, were lucky enough to get through, and their job was intelligence. They were spies. And they were all kids, because they were kids. I mean, some of them were 18, and the oldest of the agents in his mid-20s. So these were kids, and some of them were street kids, basically. They were all from the Arab world. They'd all kind of washed up in pre-state Palestine from places like Aleppo, which is where Isaac was from, or Damascus, or Yemen, and they were on the margins of Israeli society, or I guess Jewish society, because it wasn't Israeli society yet, but they were not Ashkenazim. They didn't come from the world of Yiddish. They didn't have that European Jewish tradition. They spoke Arabic. They seemed like Arabs, and that made their social lives awkward because the Jews in this country at the time did not know what to make of Jewish people who seemed like Arabs, and they seemed like the enemy. Who are these people? And they couldn't fit in. And then it turned out that they had something very useful to offer, which is that they could be spies, because they can cross enemy lines and live under Arab identities on the other side of the line. And they start doing that in the 1940s, and they are thrown into the War of Independence and experience the War of Independence in a completely different way than everyone else. they experience Israel's creation while living as Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And they spend the first 2 years of Israel's existence pretending to be Arab refugees from Palestine. But they're actually Jewish refugees from Arab countries, and they're pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country. And there's so much going on in their story, and there's so much identity confusion that if you can really get at the heart of their story, you understand a lot about Israel. Because, as we've mentioned, at least half of the Jews in Israel are the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people who came from that world. And if you understand these spies and their weird identity game and the way they saw 1948, then I think a lot about Israel in 2020 becomes clearer.
Right, and you write in the book, and you shine a light on this, that before the War of Independence in 1947-48, most of the Jews who lived in Palestine were Ashkenazi. Not all, but most of them. And
9 out of 10.
It's like, who's this that we have the picture of here? This is one of the spies.
Right, this is one of the 4 main characters in my book. It's a lovely, it's an amazing picture. That's Yakuba Cohen, who of my 4 spies, the 4 spies that I concentrate on in the book, he's the most colorful character. He's very brave. He's kind of brash. He's a lot to handle. He doesn't like following orders, but he's probably the bravest of all the characters. And here he is in the mid-40s, dressed in the uniform of an Arab militia called the Najada. So he's in kind of Arab guise. But Yakuba is a Jewish kid who grew up actually in Jerusalem, near the vegetable market in West Jerusalem, Machne Yehuda. He grew up in a family that was from Persia, so not an Arabic-speaking family, but there was so much Arabic around him as a child, spoken both by Arab kids who he grew up with and Jewish kids in his neighborhood who came from Arab countries. So he picks up Arabic and becomes one of the leading members of the Arab section, and actually has an intelligence career that stretches into his 70s. He's still active in the intelligence world in his 70s, which is quite amazing. So that's Yakuba as a young man. He must be about 20 in the picture.
So your characters are all concerned during the War of Independence that by creating the state of Israel, they may destroy these ancient Jewish communities in the Middle East, from Fez and Tunis and Cairo all the way to Aleppo and Baghdad. In Baghdad, 1 of every 3 people is Jewish.
Right, in the 40s, right?
So they're afraid, and they tell this to their handlers, their Ashkenazi handlers, and back in Israel. But ultimately, that's what happens. 1 million Jews who live in the Arab world after the state of Israel is created, which you write are being held hostage by the leaders and used as a threat against the West. Eventually, they have to flee for their lives, and most of them eventually come to Israel. The more wealthy ones, of people with means, went to the West, to France, to Canada, the United States, but the vast majority of them come to Israel. And when we talk about refugees of the War of Independence, we always hear about the Palestinian refugees who fled the war, many of them going back to where their parents had come from, in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and in Egypt, and in Iraq. But we always hear about the 650,000 Palestinian refugees who were kept in camps, many of which are today in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Syria. We never hear about the 850,000 Jewish refugees from these lands, including my in-laws who had to flee Tunis, couldn't sell their property, had to leave with everything except the shirts on their backs, and made a choice to come to Israel for ideological reasons rather than go to France where they had family. They were dumped on the border of Jordan in a mud pit, which became the Tanachim Moshavim, and from city folk, Francophile city folk, to becoming farmers overnight in the 1950s. Tell us, your book really addresses the issue, I think, for the first time, better than any other book that I've read anyway that's out there. Tell us a little bit about these issues.
I think thank you again for those kind words about the book. I think these issues are some of the biggest issues in Israeli society to this day. And a lot of time has gone by, and Israel has changed. And It's not what it was in the 50s, but the issues haven't died. People remember what happened, and the insult that many immigrants felt coming here in the late 40s and 50s and being greeted in the way that they were greeted is still felt. People's families remember it, even if it's not the original immigrants, it's their kids, it's their grandchildren. People don't forget that kind of insult easily. And although the immigrants come to identify very strongly with the state of Israel, and they're Zionists and they're part of the national story, they bear a grudge, a justified one in many cases, against the founders of the state and the systems that represent the founders of the state, the elites of the country. And that is still very much with us in elections, for example, where if you look at the support for Likud, you'll see that the support for Likud, I don't know why your in-laws vote, but support for the Likud is they were labor. The support for, there are examples like that, but Likud support leans largely on on immigrants from the Islamic world and their children and grandchildren who remember that they were treated with disdain by the labor establishment, but not by Menachem Begin, who treated them with respect. That's not the only reason, but that's still very much alive in the story of the country. People were treated as primitives when, as you mentioned, they often came from backgrounds that were more sophisticated than the backgrounds of the Ashkenazim. My grandparents were Ashkenazim. They come from, goat villages in Ukraine. They weren't, at the Sorbonne. And some people, came from the Arab world who were treated as primitives, as you said, were doctors, were French-speaking doctors from Algiers. So there was an injustice done to these people in the early years of the state, and we're still paying for it in many ways. It was one of the gravest errors made by the founding generation of Israel, and we've come a long way. Things are better than they were. We're, I think, going in the right direction, but those things don't go away in a generation or two. It takes a long time, and those wounds are going to be with us for a while.
Right. You wrote in I believe it was Spies, you wrote, "This is all complicated and uncomfortable for the Arab world. It leads to questions about where the Egyptian Jews have gone, and the Iraqi Jews and the Moroccan Jews, and why." So we're talking about refugees going both ways. Where are, this 2,000-year-old rich history of Jewish communities in the Middle East are gone. Why doesn't the West talk about that? Why doesn't the media talk about that? Why don't they talk about the Jewish refugee issue? And today, after the whole ISIS debacle and all the minorities flooding Europe, that's not the focus in the media. It's the Arab, the Islamic Arab refugees that they tend to focus on.
I think there's a few things going on there. One is that, as we mentioned, people like stories about themselves. So for people from the West, reporters, academics, they like a story about Israel as a European country because that's the kind of story that makes sense to them. They don't care about people from Tunis or Morocco or Aleppo. Who cares? A story about Europeans is much more interesting. So that's part of what's going on. Another part of what's going on is that Israel has always tried to present itself as European. So, if you look at the old propaganda images, put out by the JNF in the early days, there are these blonde pioneers hoeing the fields and listening to Beethoven at night. And that was a big part of the self-image of the country, although it was never true. But that was what Israelis wanted to be. The Jews had spent centuries in Europe being treated as swarthy Oriental foreigners, and they wanted to be European. They wanted to be blonde. That was part of Zionism, as strange and unfortunate as it is looking back. But that was part of what was going on. So Israel tried to describe itself as European and obscured the fact that, at least in the early days of the country, there was a distinct non-European majority among Israel's Jews. That evens out when the Russian immigrants arrive in the 1990s. But for decades, there are more Middle Eastern Jews here than European Jews, but that's obscured by the official narrative. So we're also responsible for that. And the last part of it is, as you mentioned, the desire by the Arab world to erase what happened to their own Jewish communities. So if the Arab world can successfully portray Israel as a colonialist implant, and Israelis are all blonde, crusaders, then that is great, because then no one will ask the question that Arab countries don't want anyone to ask, which is what happened to your Jewish communities. If you go to Cairo, and I imagine you've been there, and I have been there, and if you walk around downtown Cairo, there's a big part of downtown Cairo that's called the Jewish Quarter. Harat al-Yehud, it's still called that. There are no Jews left. Where did they go? If you walk around any Arab city, there's a Jewish quarter. Any major Arab city has a Jewish quarter. There's no Jews in any of them. Where are they? I've seen the Jewish quarters in Marrakesh and Fez, and they're empty. Where is everyone? And the answer is, in many cases, they're in Israel. They're Israelis. The Israelis are not some European colonialist who arrived, from England. The Israelis are the guy who used to run the store in Baghdad down your street, and it's your school teacher from Tunis. And those people were driven out of their homes and their property was stolen. And that's all very uncomfortable for the Arab world. So it's much better to just pretend that Israel is a project of colonialist Europeans. And there's kind of a confluence of interests where everyone buys that story, Westerners because they want Western story, Arab people in the Arab states because they want a story that absolves them of their ethnic cleansing of their neighbors, and Israelis who've always wanted to be European. So everyone agreed on this narrative, which obscured the fact that it's not true.
Right. Well, Matti Friedman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. All three of your books are riveting. Are you working on, before we go, are you working on anything else that we have
I'm working on a few. I'm writing stories for the New York Times op-ed section. I write essays, kind of deep dives into Israeli history and culture. I just published a story on one of Israel's most interesting pop singers, who's an Arab Muslim singer who converted to Judaism and sings in Hebrew, and she's an absolutely fascinating character who has a lot to tell us about the state of Israel. So I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to stay sane with 4 kids at home in this crazy time, and that's pretty much a full-time job at the moment.
Great. Well, I appreciate it. I hope when tourists come back, you'll continue with our breakfast conversations in the hotels with tourists. Thanks again. Thank you, Jonathan Rose in the background, our producer and engineer, and Condé Nast Traveler Israel Specialist for 2020. And I will see you all again soon. And hopefully this thing will be over soon. And I'll see you here in Israel in person. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.